Hello. We're going to try to record this lecture. We shall see how it goes. Keep your fingers crossed. In my opening lecture on the Magic Mountain last time, I identified several themes that Mann introduces as a kind of overture in the opening chapters, and that he develops in extraordinary breadth and depth throughout this massive novel. And I want to identify them again now at the start, because my remarks today will touch upon several of these intertwined themes. First, there's the mysterious and paradoxical nature of time, as Hans comes to experience it and to understand it, even in his early days at the Berghof Sanatorium. A second prominent theme is Mann's sense of the mythic nature of human identity, and more broadly, the ways in which the past shapes human personality. This includes, for Hans, the family past, which remains alive within him, he believes. But more broadly and importantly, it refers to the distant racial past. We find in ancient times, Mans believed, individuals who were more self-aware of the expression of typology and ancient pattern in their behavior, patterns that originate in the collective unconscious. Now, Hans has a deep feeling for his family past from the start, for the fact that even though he's an orphan, generations of his family reenacted the same ritual with a single baptismal bowl. This is something that moves him and fascinates him. But Hans also shows early hints of a kind of mythic consciousness, as Mann would have it, a sense of patterns more deeply and anciently that are structuring his experience, though he'll never perhaps fully understand what they are consciously. A third theme that Mann introduces through Hans is the twofold nature of death. Hans recognizes this dualism even as a precocious child. He loses both parents and his beloved grandfather in rapid succession, and he thinks a lot about death. At the Berghof, seeing terminally ill patients and hearing about deaths every day, Hans feels a revival of the childhood sense of death that he experienced at his grandfather's coffin. Death, that is, both as a solemn spiritual phenomenon and also as a profoundly physical one. On the one hand, it's a passage into a purely spiritual dimension, as Hans thinks of it, but on the other, it is a state of rank corporeal decay. For Mann, this dualism, like all other dualisms, ultimately traces back to the conflicted nature of Adam Quadmon, that originary being of pure spirit and light who fell into matter and became enfleshed in the process. Out of this initial conflict of spirit and matter, out of that combination, arose all the intellectual conflicts and debates that play out within the novel about the status of the body and the mind, society and history and life itself. They all grow out of the fundamental dualism for Mann of spirit and matter. Now, the intellectual dialectic that I've just referred to is the fourth major theme that Mann introduces with the appearance early in the novel of Herr Setembrini. A fifth theme that Mann establishes even earlier is perhaps the most complex of all. It's the relationship between sickness and two things, intellectual development on the one hand and sexual desire on the other. I'm going to be devoting a good portion of today's commentary to this particular issue, but note that from the start, Mann focuses almost exclusively in this meditation on the nature of disease on one particular disease, tuberculosis, though this illness manifests itself in a variety of different symptoms. TB, or consumption as it was called, has long been surrounded with mythic associations or symbolic associations. Prior to the rise of sanitariums at the beginning of the 20th century, like the Berghof, tuberculosis was regarded as an absolute death sentence. But in the 19th century, literary representations of consumption saw the illness as something that refined and spiritualized the victim, even as it took his or her life. We see this, for example, in novels like Jane Eyre, where Jane's friend Ellen Byrne becomes sanctified as she wastes away, and in Dostoevsky's novels, where sufferers like Father Zosimov's brothers in the Brothers Karamazov are moved to a sanctifying discovery of God as their flesh vanishes from their bones. Consumption is also sometimes associated with literary creativity. because of its famous victims. They include John Keats, the great Romantic poet, and in the 20th century, Franz Kafka, D.H. Lawrence, and Catherine Mansfield. Susan Sontag, in her fascinating book, Disease as Metaphor, discusses these particular associations with consumption, but she also notes the very different stigma that attaches to cancer as a kind of horrific contagion. Now, Mann invests tuberculosis with his own psychological and ethical implications, and in doing so, he reverses the idea, the 19th century idea, of the disease as purifying and spiritually refining. Instead of spiritualizing, Hans's illness, one might say, sharpens his intellectual faculties, expands his mind, whets his curiosity in this novel of education. At the same time, however, consumption, above all other diseases for Mann, makes characters more physical. As the infection and the corruption of the lungs progresses, his characters become more aware of their bodies. They become more embodied, if you will, because of this inner decay. And the characters also become, at the same time, more sensually alive, more erotically aroused, more physically attached to the world that the disease threatens to take them from. Indeed, disease engenders romantic desire in Mann's work. And this is a sixth major theme played out on the Magic Mountain clearly in Hans's obsession with Claudia Schott. One that, like all romantic love in Mann, is ultimately a narcissistic fascination with the submerged part of oneself reflected in the beloved. All of this, of course, this particular nature of love, tracing back to the narcissism that led to Adam Quadmont's fall, seeing himself reflected in matter and wanting to embrace that image. Now, in studying this book of sevens, it seems only right to identify 7 themes, if somewhat contrived. But nonetheless, there is one that I'll add as a 7th, a final theme, and that is we'll be addressing the question of the theme of language. At this international sanitarium, we find a modernist babble, and Mann is going to explore problems of linguistic communication among speakers of very different tongues and their attempts to surmount those difficulties. All right. Now, with this prologue in mind, I want to begin today with the paradoxical nature of time. Hans meditates it first as he waits for the minutes to pass, 7 minutes of course, so that Joachim can read his temperature on his personal thermometer. 7 minutes must be up by now, Hans said. Joachim shook his head. After a while he took the thermometer out of his mouth, looked at it and said, "Yes, when you pay close attention to a time, it goes by very slowly. I truly like measuring my temperature 4 times a day because it makes you notice what 1 minute or 7 minute actually means, especially since the 7 days of a week hang so dreadfully heavy on our heads here." To which Hans says, "You said actually, Joachim, but actually doesn't apply," he responded. Hans was sitting with one thigh hiked up on the railing. The whites of his eyes were bloodshot. There is nothing actual about time. If it seems long to you, then it is long. And if it seems to pass quickly, then it is short. But how long or short it is, in actuality, no one knows. He was not at all used to philosophizing, and yet he felt some urge to do so. Now, the idea of clock time, as he watches Hans measure time to wait till he can read his thermometer, that idea of clock time leads Hans to suggest very much what Proust emphasizes. Specifically, the only real time is subjective time, because no 2 moments of clock-measured time are ever alike for the individual. And this is because different minds respond to the world and to time differently, but also even for the same individual, different circumstances make us feel time, experience time in different ways. To wait for something, as Hans is waiting slowly, tediously for the thermometer reading, to wait for something, Hans realizes, is to make a minute pass more slowly than it would seem to pass if one were active or interested in something. Even at a place like the Berghof, where life is organized strictly according to the movements of the clock, with prescribed meal times and prescribed periods of rest, even there, Hans finds himself rejecting the entire regimen of clock time. He sees it as artificial. And here, in a remarkably important passage, is why. A minute is as long as it lasts, Joachim says, as long as it takes a second hand to complete a circle. Consider Hans's response. But how long that takes can vary greatly, according to how we feel it. In point of fact, Hans Castorp said, pressing his forefinger so firmly against his nose that its tip was folded to one side, what's a matter of motion in space, correct? Wait, hear me out. And so we measure time with space. But that is the same thing as trying to measure space with time, the way uneducated people do. Listen here, Joachim said. What's wrong with you? I think being up here is starting to get to you, Hans. No, just be quiet. My mind is very clear today, Hans said. So then, what is time? Hans Castorp asked, bending the tip of his nose so forcefully to one side that it turned white and bloodless. Will you please tell me that? We perceive space with our senses, with vision and touch. But what is the organ of our sense of time? Would you please tell me that, Joachim? You see, you're stuck. But how are we ever going to measure something about which, precisely speaking, we know nothing at all, cannot list a single one of its properties? We say time passes. Fine, let it pass for all I care, but in order to measure it, wait. In order for it to be measurable, it would have to flow evenly. But where is it written that it does that? It doesn't do that. For our conscious minds, we simply assume time does, just for the sake of convenience. And so all our measurements are merely conventions, if you please. The uniform movements of a clock hand, Hans says, can't reflect our variable subjective sense of temporal progression as fast or slow, because clock time is measured in equidistant increments, and those are increments ultimately of space. The clock face, with the hand moving spatially around it, reflects what? It reflects the motion in space of the Earth turning on its axis each day, and in space the revolution of the Earth around the Sun each year. You can't measure the experience of time by spatial coordinates, Hans says, any more than you could measure space through time. Hans later decides that subjective time is, as he puts it, like a column of mercury without a scale, that is to say, without equidistant increments, because it can't be calibrated. Time can't be measured that way. Underlying Hans's observation, which baffles the long-suffering Joachim, the pragmatic Joachim, is a great paradox, one that Mann's narrator explains soon after, and that Hans himself is slowly beginning to understand. The paradox is this. It is generally believed that by filling time with things new and interesting, we make it pass, by which we mean shorten it. Monotony and emptiness, however, are said to weigh down and to hinder time's passage. This is not true of all conditions, though. Emptiness and monotony may stretch a moment or even an hour and make it boring, but they can likewise abbreviate and dissolve large, indeed the largest units of time, until they seem nothing at all. Conversely, rich and interesting events are capable of filling time, until hours, even days, are shortened and speed passed on wings, whereas on a larger scale, interest lends the passage of time breadth, solidity, weight, so that the years rich in events pass much more slowly than do paltry, bare, featherweight years that are blown before the wind and are gone. Now, Mann is going to explore several paradoxes of time in this novel, but the one that he describes here is the central one. When we live by a routine, time in the short term seems to pass slowly in any given hour or any given day. Yet because of this very sameness, repetition and routine and lack of variety, in the long term, under those circumstances, time seems to pass quickly over large stretches. When our experience is undifferentiated, time seems thinned out. Months and years ultimately fade into one another, as if 7 years could be 1 year, even though in the short term it seems to go slowly. By contrast, when we are encountering new experiences, especially say on a trip or a semester abroad, constantly encountering novelty and stimulation, when we're outside any set routine, any familiar repetition, under those circumstances, any hour or any day is so thick with novel incident that it seems to fly by in the shortest terms, okay, because we're so engaged. Yet, over a long stretch of weeks or months, these variations, this newness, that that stimulates us and makes time seem to go fast, over a longer stretch, it thickens our experience of time so that time seems slower in its movements because the weeks or months have been so crowded with incident, so crowded with novelty. Here's how Mann explains it. When one day is like another day, then all days are like one, and perfect homogeneity would make the longest life seem very short, as if it had flown by in a twinkling. On the other hand, we know full well that the insertion of new habits or the changing of old ones is the only way to preserve life and to renew our sense of time, to rejuvenate intensity and retard our experience of time, and thereby renew our sense of life itself. Now, there is really a double paradox at the heart of what Mann is describing. Time that is slow in small increments passes quickly or seems to pass quickly over large ones. And, on the other hand, time that passes quickly in small increments because we are so engaged seems over a longer stretch of time to pass more slowly because it is so thickened and diversified. Hans senses these things, but he cannot yet put them into words because, as we'll see, conceptual language is always challenging and difficult. But Mann assures us that the double paradox I've just described is what Hans is struggling to explain to his cousin when he begins by meditating upon the peculiar nature of time. These remarks, Mann's narrator says, are inserted here only because young Hans Castorp had something similar in mind when a few days later he said to his cousin while gazing at him with bloodshot eyes, "I've always found it odd, and still do, how time seems to go slowly in a strange place. It has nothing to do with reason or with measurements of time. It's purely a matter of feeling." Now, usually one appreciates the slowing and thickening of time only when one has, over a period of weeks or months, say on a trip or in some novel circumstance, been able to look back near the end of it or perhaps when it is over. Okay? What is remarkable here is that Hans, after just a single day or two, has already begun to understand how the strange experiences outside his flatlands routine, how this sort of bombardment of new impressions had begun to draw out time, to slow it down in a very different way from the short-term slowness that he feels in moments of boredom. Here's how Hans puts it. He says, "Good Lord, Joachim, is this still just my first day? It seems to me if I'd been up here with you for a long, long time." To which Joachim says, "Now don't start theorizing again about time." But again, a little bit later, we're told of Hans, "If I had not been here for just a day, but considerably longer, it's almost as if I had grown older and wiser. So it seems to me, being up here." Now, perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Hans's temporal experience in his first week at the Berghof is that he begins to experience time as passing both quickly and slowly simultaneously. Consider this description of his temporal response. We're told for Hans Castorp, the initial refreshment of his sense of time was long since past. The days during his week began to fly now, and yet each one of these days was stretched by renewed expectations and swollen with silent private experiences. Yes, time is a puzzling thing. There is something about it that is hard to explain. Now, at this point in his stay of a week at the Berghof, Hans finds that the days seem to fly by because they follow the same routine and thus they blend into one another, the same way months and years will blend into one another. And yet, at the same time, because these days are so packed with novelty and thought and interest and curiosity that he's not accustomed to, things he hasn't seen, at the same time, his days, on a smaller scale, each one seems to swell with new impressions, ideas, and desires, so that over the course of the week, even as the routine seems to in some way make time go slower, the novelty makes time go faster. and seems to thicken and thus slow time's passage. Now, Mann allows his reader, I think, to experience, not just understand conceptually, but I think experience something like Hans's paradoxical sense of time passing both quickly and slowly at once in the way in which he paces this narrative. The first week of Hans's 7-year stay at the sanitarium covers about 140 pages. Our journey through his life is, in these 140 pages, slowed and thickened because of the abundance of new experiences and ideas that we register through Hans at the sanitarium. And indeed, in reading it, we may very often pause to absorb the information or even reread it. But at the same time, if we are engaged by the strangeness of this novel, if we're fascinated, as Hans is, by what he sees at the Berghof, then the book simultaneously seems to race by as we read any given chapter enthralled and seems to go quickly, or at least I hope it does for you. Now, Hans's contemplation of his temporal experience and its paradoxes come in moments of clarity, which are the prime manifestation at this point of his intellectual growth. But they are also, these ideas that come to him, a sign of the disease gathering inside him, which for Mann is inseparable from that intellectual development. Hans finds lying out on his balcony, thinking during the rest cure, extremely appealing because the inertia that is intended to heal infected lungs also stimulates his mind as he meditates and questions and remembers things that had never entered his mind before. His yet undiagnosed lung infection, then, makes him more thoughtful and allows him to indulge his long-standing preference for contemplation over work. But this same organic contamination in his lungs that promotes thought and understanding has another very different effect. It also increases Hans's libidinal desires. Consumption has this effect on nearly all of the patients at the Berghof. They carry on clandestine affairs, sometimes adulterously. They carry them on in the dark, behind closed doors, and sometimes even in the local town. Indeed, one might say appetites of all kinds seem to intensify in the sanitarium high in the mountains, including the urge to eat. 5 meals a day are served, each with many courses, and Mann enumerates these courses in a description that gives us a sense of the lavishness of this comestible phenomenon. The dinner was as splendidly prepared as it was lavish, including the nourishing soup. It consisted of no fewer than 6 courses. The fish was followed by a superb roast with vegetables, which was followed by a salad, then roast fowl, a dumpling dessert in no way inferior to the one that Hans had eaten the night before, and finally cheese and fruit. Each item was offered twice, and not without good effect. People filled their plates at all 7 tables, and they ate with their appetites of lions here in these vaulted spaces. Theirs was a hot hunger that it would have been a joy to observe if its effect had not at the same time somehow seemed eerie and even repulsive. Well, the patient's appetite increases partly, of course, because of the thin mountain air, which accelerates their metabolism and thus their hunger. But their appetite also is rooted in the fact that because they are diseased, they have an increased need for sensual pleasure and thus increased ingestion. That is, disease makes the residents, including Hans, more intensely physical, more sensate, more sybaritic, even as it also moves Hans, as we've seen, to increasingly ideational and abstract thinking. In short, the onset of disease in the rarefied alpine air brings out in Hans both sides of that fundamental division in human nature that Mann traces back to the Gnostic myth, the conflicting desires in Adam Quad Mann, on the one hand, toward the abstract, reascension to a realm of spirit and form, and on the other, to a fuller, more sensual embrace of the physical world. But at this point, we should note that For Mann, there are two very different ways of being drawn to the corporeal, to the physical world. One of them, of course, is the bourgeois way that Hans grew up in the flatlands, with its routines and its clear, healthy balance of work, its pragmatism, and its simple pleasures, the schnitzel and the cigars that are the counterbalance to the work that men do in their offices and in their shops. All of it is a kind of embrace of the material world in its simplest aspects. The other longing for the corporeal, however, and a very different one, is Dionysian. That is to say, the other often repressed side of the artistic sensibility. The longing that the Dionysian figure feels for the material is a desire to revel in the excess of the physical in ways that modest bourgeois minds regard as corrupt. The Dionysian urge is to embrace physical reality through passionate erotic release, through alcohol and drugs and other transgressive experiments in the realm of the senses. This Dionysian attraction to the material world, to the dangerous mysteries of the body and senses, is what Hans' love interest, the Russian Klavdia Shoshat, embodies and practices as an artist type. She celebrates the sensual release, and this is part of what Hans finds, of course, so tempting, so alluring in her. He is drawn to Klavdia and her Dionysian pleasures before his mind allows him to acknowledge it. Under the influence of this exotic Russian woman, just a glance at her or the sound of the slamming door before he even knows that she is responsible for it is enough to make his heart race and his temperature literally rise. And before he even knows Klavdia, these effects somehow puzzle him. We're told, "If I only knew," Hans Castorp continued, pressing his hands to his breast like a man in love, "why my heart keeps pounding the whole time, it's disconcerting." Like a man in love? He's in a sense a man in love before he even knows that he is in love or even knows that the object causing the slamming of the door is a woman. It's as if the body were going off on its own and no longer had any connections to the soul, more or less like a dead body that's not really dead, even though there's no such thing, Hans said, and goes on living a very active life, but all of its own accord. Well, these effects are so puzzling that Hans observes one literally searches for some reason, for some emotional stimulus, a feeling of joy or fear that could justify these feelings, so to speak. At least that how it is with me. I can only speak for myself. Well, for Mann, the body is a kind of text on which our unconscious, unrecognized desires become imprinted. And at this point, Hans's desire for Klavdia is still unconscious, repressed by his sense that she represents everything that his bourgeois culture has taught him to fear and reject. But his bodily symptoms register that desire that his mind refuses to recognize. Now, remember, at this point, he seems unconsciously to know that somehow the slamming of the door must be connected with a woman. It somehow moves him in this physical way, feverishly, and yet he can't understand it. But consider his first response when he actually sees the door slammer, when he actually lays eyes on Klavdia for the first time. It was a lady who crossed the hall now, a young woman, a girl really, of only average height, in a white sweater and brightly colored skirt with reddish blonde hair, which she wore in a simple braid wound up on her head. Hans Castorp saw only a little of her profile, almost nothing in fact. In quite marvelous contrast to her noisy entrance, the slamming door, she walked soundlessly with a peculiar slinking gait, her head thrust slightly forward, and proceeded to the furthest table on the left, set perpendicular to the veranda doors, the good Russian table. And then he watches her more closely. The hand tucking up her hair was not particularly ladylike, not refined or well cared for, nor in the way the ladies in young Hans Castorp's social circle cared for theirs. It was rather a broad hand with stubby fingers. There was something primitive and childish about it, rather like the hand of a schoolgirl. Her nails were clearly had never seen a manicure and had been trimmed carelessly, again like a schoolgirl's, and the cuticles had a jagged look, almost as if she were guilty of the minor vice of nail chewing. Hans Castorp only surmised all this, however, more than he actually saw it. She was already too far away. Hans is riveted on first glance by Claudia's foreign beauty, but also by her unkemptness, by her uncleanliness, by her bad habits, by her carelessness, her slackness, her defiance of decorum and reason and manners, all of which are expressed in that gesture of letting the door slam that had so obsessed him and that had somehow in his mind unconsciously been linked with the idea of a woman. Above all, though, Hans is aroused by Claudia's Eastern sensuality, by the cheekbones that are high and prominent, by her slightly slanted gray-blue eyes. She is not, clearly, as an artist figure, an Apollonian artist figure like Setembrini. Rather, she's an Dionysian artist figure, one who is, in that respect, even more antithetical to Hans's outward bourgeois self than the Apollonian artist Setembrini. Therefore, what Hans craves in Claudia from the start, without fully understanding it, is really the outward expression of a submerged anterior part of himself. But it is this submerged artist self in Hans, something that is far less deeply buried in him than it is in most other bourgeois men, such as his cousin Joachim. But the fact is that even Joachim isn't immune to a desire for his opposite, which is to say, a submerged part of himself. Hans notices that Joachim's complexion changes when this most upright and disciplined of bourgeois men, this soldier, sees the curvaceous and giggling Marisha, erotically alluring, diseased and forbidden. She is the antithesis of everything Joachim represents and wants to return to. The stricken look on Joachim's face when he sees Marissa, the look of tortured desire, suggests his struggle to subdue his own dangerous longing for her. Hans, of course, puts up far less of a struggle than his cousin. After seeing Claudia for the first time, he begins to fetishize each one of her carefully observed physical and behavioral traits until the mere thought of each one in his mind is enough to send his heart beating. Well, the relationship then between eros and disease is reciprocal. Just as the presence of disease brings forth and increases sexual longing, so too sexual longing brings forth or intensifies disease and its manifestations of symptoms. And this is precisely what happens to Hans. For no sooner has he seen Claudia, before he even knows her name, than he sees the first indication of the consumption that he has been harboring. His secret desire for Claudia, if you will, brings forth that disease symptomatically, because after that first glimpse, shortly thereafter, we're told, his heart was pounding as he drew in air through his mouth. When he used his handkerchief, Hans found red traces of blood, but he did not have the energy to think about it much, although he was easily inclined to worry about himself and tended by nature to be a hypochondriac. This didn't bother him. Now, Hans isn't panicked by the blood, but unconsciously he already knows he is ill, and the disease will keep him at the clinic near Claudia. Indeed, perhaps that's one reason he isn't panicked. Hans's underlying infection makes him susceptible to Claudia, and it fuels his desire for every forbidden Dionysian trait that she embodies. But the real origin of Hans's attraction to Claudia goes back not only before he ever saw her, but it goes back even before he ever came to the Berghof. It lies in the, quote, vague memory of somebody that comes to Hans when he first sees Claudia. He has a vague memory of somebody. We learn the identity of this figure, Claudia's predecessor, when Hans sheds blood a second time as a symptom of his illness. Having been agitated and confused by his feelings for Claudia on first seeing her, he decides to go for a hike in the mountains alone in order to try to work off or in some way free himself from this passionate confusion. And he pushes himself in this strenuous activity a bit too far. Hans had no sooner made himself comfortable on a bench in the mountains than his nose began to bleed, so suddenly that he was unable to keep his suit from being stained a little. The flow of blood was strong and persistent, and it kept him occupied for a good half hour. He lies down on the bench. and Hans found himself lying down, transported to an earlier stage of life, one which only a few nights before had served as the basis for a dream filled with more recent impressions. And as he was pulled back into the then and there, time and space were abrogated so intensely, so totally, that one might have thought a lifeless body lay there on the bench beside the torrent, while the real Hans Castorp was moving about in an earlier time, in different surroundings, confronted by a situation that, for all of its simplicity, he found both fraught with risk and filled with intoxication. Hans's blood flow suddenly, as he lies there, conjures up a memory of an event at school, recess, in his adolescence. A memory that he had tried and failed to capture through will, but had earlier dreamed about and forgotten. He realizes that Klavdia looks like an exotic boy that he knew at school, named Prislav Hippie. Now, like Proust's Madeline experience, this intense memory is involuntary and sudden. But whereas Marcel's memory is dredged from the psychic depths by a sensory association of taste, Hans's involuntary recall of something from his unconscious comes through the awakening of a disease that is lurking within his body and manifests itself in the shedding of blood. We later learn that the trigger for this memory is the activation of an earlier tubercular infection that originated in Hans's adolescence at a time when he fell in love with Prislav Hippie. Now, Hippie is not only like Klavdia in appearance, but he also shares her husky voice, striking cheekbones, and curious uncleanliness. Here's how Hans remembers him so vividly. It was during recess between two periods of the day for Hans Castorp class, between history and drawing. Yes, and there was a boy. The boy that Hans was looking at was named Hippie, Prislav Hippie. He was decidedly foreign. He was obviously the product of an ancient mixing of races, the blending of German blood with Welsh Wendish, or vice versa. He was blond and his hair was kept trimmed close to his round head, but his eyes, bluish-gray or grayish-blue eyes, rather indefinite, looked closely at you, and they had a slightly slanted shape. And right below those eyes were prominent, strong, distinctive cheekbones. Unusual features. Plus, Prislav Hippie wore a blue jacket, gathered at the back and buttoning up to the collar. There were a few flakes of dandruff, unusually scattered there. We're told that Hans followed him with his eyes, admired him with his glances. Should one say admired him? Oh, in any case, Hans observed him with ever-growing sympathy, says the ironic narrator. Like Hans's desire for the married Klavdia, his homoerotic love for Prislav Hippie is forbidden. In fact, Hans can't even name his desire in his own mind. He won't give it a name because, of course, it would be difficult to understand, and also he would be afraid of it. But the very forbiddenness of it that he senses makes those feelings more vexing and more delightful, as it's described here. And in some ways, more powerful. Note, too, that the physical effects, as he watches Prislav Hippie with fascination, are similar to those that occur when he watches Klavdia. But here, the desire, we'll see, is going to be entirely repressed with Prislav Hippie. And the physical effects of feeling passionate desire, erotic longing, and then not acting on it, because the closest Hans comes is asking to borrow a pencil, the effect of those erotic desires that are repressed is precisely the subject of Dr. Krakowski's lectures on, quote, love as a force conducive to illness. That is, how sexual love manifests itself as illness, particularly when it is repressed and unenacted. This is what Hans hears at the lecture. Krakowski explains, fear, conventionality, repressed love, held desire chained in darkness, at best giving it only partially to its wild demands, but certainly never permitting them a conscious active existence in all their variety and vigor. Except that chastity only apparently triumphed. Its victory was actually a Pyrrhic victory because the demands of love could not be fettered or coerced. Suppressed love was not dead. It continued to live on in the dark, secret depths, straining for fulfillment, and broke the bands of chastity and reappeared, though in transmuted, unrecognizable form. And in what form or mask did suppressed and unsanctioned love appear? Dr. Krakowski looked up and down the rows as he asked this question, as if seriously expecting an answer from his listeners, which he then provided himself. And Dr. Krakowski said, "In the form of illness." Any symptom of illness was a masked form of love in action, and illness was merely transformed love. Hans is a textbook illustration of Krakowski's theory with Prislav Hippie, because he suffers the corporeal consequences that Krakowski describes. The lung infection that caused his bloody cough and his bloody nose due to his attraction to Claudia actually began years earlier when he fell in love and failed to act on his desire for Prislav. That love went no further than the borrowing of a pencil, whose sharpened savings Hans keeps as a keepsake in his desk. But that initial suppressed desire infected his lung and left a scar, and that infection then revives, opens up again when he sees and feels the same desire for Claudia years later. Hans begins to understand this connection even before his medical diagnosis that confirms that he has tuberculosis. We're told that as he thinks about the two of them, Prislav and Claudia, he thinks, "I would have never thought that I'd see him so clearly again as in that moment of memory. And he looks so strangely like her, that woman up here. Is that why I've been so intrigued by her? Or maybe that's why I was so suddenly interested in him. What nonsense." And a little later again, he again ponders the connection between the two of them and his interest in them. Resembled, he thinks, Prislav Hippie and that woman? No, that was not the right word. They were the same exact eyes, and the breadth of the upper half of the face, the flat nose, everything, including the flush of the white skin. Yes, all of that, all of that. Now, Hans's blurring in his mind of Prislav Hippie and Claudia, and his confusion also as to cause and effect, am I interested in her because I was interested in him, or do I remember my interest in him only because I see her? This confusion is telling because it reveals a great deal about the nature of love in Mon. First, the reason why so many of Mon's protagonists are bisexual is that what they really crave in the other, in the object of desire, isn't so much a person of the opposite gender as it is a person of the opposite type. That is, each individual seems to carry in his or her unconscious a template of what the desirable opposite looks like and what they embody. And this typological template, if you will, is really what matters. When we recognize it in the visible world, we immediately fall in love, regardless of whether the embodiment of that type, in this case Dionysian, is a male or a female. Now, if for D.H. Lawrence, then, gender overrides even our species when it comes to matters of attraction, for Mon, typology overrides gender in love. Thus, Hans finds that Prislav and Claudia are versions of one another. They both trace back to the same prototype, the same template buried in his unconscious. And indeed, he had dreamed of Hippie, it turns out, one night before consciously recalling him during the nosebleed on the bench in the mountains. A second thing that we realize about Hans's blurring of Claudia and Hippie, at least implicitly, is that both loves are, like all romantic love in Thomas Mann, ultimately narcissistic. In both cases, Hans is drawn to submerged aspects of his own nature, reflected in another. Now, reflecting this submerged part of himself, Claudia, with her grayish blue eyes, her Kirag's shaped slant and her voluptuous lips. She is both alluring to Hans narcissistically, but also frightening because she embodies everything within him that his outward bourgeois nature regards as forbidden and dangerous, not only in the world, but in himself. As a boy, as an adolescent, Hans was able to control his desire for Prislav through bourgeois modesty. He was able to sublimate it, but of course the price he paid is disease, as Krakowski explains. But with Klavdia, as an older individual, he feels that the barrier of restraint can no longer hold, particularly when he looks and sort of relishes different parts of Klavdia's body. When, for example, he sees her at Krakowski's lecture, he looks at her arms. But this arm was more beautiful. This arm bent gently behind her head and was barely clad because the fabric of the sleeve was thinner than that of the blouse, the flimsiest gossamer, which lent the arm just a hint of delicate illusion, making it even prettier than it probably would have been without any covering. It was both tender and full at the same moment, and cool, and one could only presume there could be no question whatever of any counteracting bourgeois force now. Note that in a certain way, the allure of her body slightly covered is stronger than it would have been if it was bare. The thin covering, the translucent veil that gives a hint of the underlying shape, arouses him. But you'll note here that there is, as Hans recognizes, an obvious moral hazard in craving such a woman that no bourgeois man should ever crave, partly because she is married. But there is something even more dangerous than the fact that she's married or that she embodies a kind of Dionysian license. There is, in fact, something in Hans's love that reveals a third important aspect of desire that Mann presents to us at this point in the novel. Hans's attraction to Klavdia is not just a longing for her sensual body or for her slack habits. It is also an attraction to her disease, and by extension, to his own disease, and ultimately, through her, an attraction to death. Hans will discover this gradually. One understands why he certainly doesn't any more than Gerald Critch want to face it initially. As he sits in the passage I just read, gazing at Klavdia's arms, he intuits this danger without yet being able to put it into words. But what happened when the woman that one was drawn to was sick inside, so that she was not at all suited for motherhood? What then? Was there any point in her wearing gossamer sleeves so that men would be curious about her body, about her diseased body? There was obviously no point in that whatever, and it ought to be considered improper, to be forbidden, because for man to be interested in a sick woman was certainly no more reasonable than for Hans Castorp to have pursued his silent interest in Prislav Hippie way back when. Hans reminds himself of Klavdia's sickness, ostensibly here to warn himself, but more deeply because the fact is that the idea of her corrupt body attracts him as an aspect of her total being. And this becomes unmistakably clear the more he talks about her diseased body. Yes, Frostschot was sick, listless, feverish, worm-eaten deep inside, a condition that was closely bound up with the dubious nature of her whole being, and that itself contributed strongly to Hans Castorp's sense of caution and need to keep his distance, but also the deepest source of her allure for him. Given this attraction to disease and death that he also tries to fight against, you might find it curious that after Hans's bloody cough and bloody nose, he pays little heed consciously to these sanguine discharges. Why does he pay so little attention to them? Well, consciously, he's afraid to admit that he's sick because, as he repeatedly tells himself, I'm a civilian and I'm scheduled to return to Hamburg and take up a position with my engineering degree. But the deeper, unacknowledged reason why Hans ignores these symptoms, they come, he looks at them, and then he thinks about them not at all. The deeper reason is because unconsciously he is glad of them. Secretly he's relieved because he senses that they will allow him to stay on at the Berghof as a patient near Klavdia. In fact, by the start of his second week on the Magic Mountain, Hans is already becoming anxious at the very prospect of having to leave. He has, by this point, purchased special blankets that he delights in his acquired skill of wrapping around him in a kind of cartoon-like way during the rest cure. He's mastered that. And remember that Behrens told Hans that he'd be an ideal patient. Indeed, Hans repeats that to himself, that he'll be an ideal patient, in a vivid dream, the first part of which is clearly a kind of wish fulfillment, because the disease that's confirmed in this dream will allow him to stay at the Berghof. Hans dreamed that he saw Director Behrens wandering along the paths of the garden, his knees slightly bent, his arms hanging stiffly at an angle in front of him, marching his slow and yet somehow bleak strides to the rhythm of march music in the distance. "Respectable citizen," Behrens said. "I could tell right off about you, but not without talent, certainly not without talent for raising his general metabolism. Won't be stingy about a few little years here, a few spiffling years of service with us up here." Well, note that Hans wants to stay, obviously, and Behrens in the dream confirms that wish. It's a wish fulfillment. But why does he wish to stay? Well, that answer in itself is manifold, and it tells us a great deal about Hans. First, as I've noted, he likes what Setembrini describes derisively as the horizontal life, the life of contemplation rather than life of work. That's possible only up here. For Hans was a patient man by nature who could spend long hours doing nothing in particular and loved, as we recall, his leisure time, with no numbing activity to demolish, banish, or overwhelm him, the way it would when he went back to the lowlands. Now, note that one of many paradoxes in the Magic Mountain here is that although Hans thinks of his mental development as a form of leisure as opposed to work, Hans actually is working intellectually very hard. He's thinking harder and more deeply in the privacy of his room and on the balcony during the rest cure and in conversation with men like Setembrini than he ever has before in his life. Laziness, as Hans thinks of it, is actually the key to learning. Laziness is work. Leisure is a form of productivity. Hans, the unwritten page, wants very much to learn. A second reason he wants to remain at the Berghof is, of course, Klavdia. At meals, he and the elderly dinner companion at his table, Frau Engelhardt, watch Klavdia over at the good Russian table, and they tease and titillate each other about their shared attraction to her. The school teacher's delight is doubly vicarious. She sees Klavdia through Hans's devouring eyes and desires him in her own lesbian way, vicariously through him. But Frau Engelhardt is also aroused and enlivened, if you will, by Hans's desire itself. That moves her. She reads Hans's desire in the position of his head, as he tries, whenever he looks at Klavdia, to steady the slight tremor that she causes just by looking at her in his body at every meal. Now, at first, Hans does not allow himself to admit this desire consciously, but it certainly emerges in the second part of his multipartite dream, before he ever admits to himself that he craves Klavdia. In the second part of that dream, we're told, after Behrens leaves, Hans was just about to borrow a drawing pencil from Madame Chauchat, who also happened to be present. She gave him a reddish one, about half the normal length, in a silver holder, but at the same time she warned Hans Castorp in a pleasantly husky voice that he definitely had to give it back to her after class, and looked at him with her narrow bluish-gray eyes set above the broad cheekbones, and he tore himself out of the dream because he had it now and wanted to hold on to the dream, the person and the situation that she had so vividly reminded him of. Now, note that Hans's attraction here is interesting because this too is a wish fulfillment. Even before he consciously linked Klavdia with Prislav Hippie after the nosebleed, in this dream, which comes earlier, Han had linked the two of them unconsciously in this part of his dream. After all, it was the pencil that he borrowed from Prislav Hippie. Now he is borrowing it from Klavdia. This part of the dream, then, like the one with Behrens, is also a wish fulfillment in the Freudian sense. The pencil establishes a bond of intimacy with a woman that he has heretofore only gazed at from a distance, and in some ways allows him to fantasize what it would have been somehow if he had become more intimate with Prislav Hippie. The two blur together here in a single icon of desire. And he wants to hold on to that even when he wakes up because it fills him with pleasure, a pleasure that he had not allowed himself to enjoy in life. Consider also the phallic implications of this reddish pencil. They seem obvious. Hans is aroused in this dream sexually. But Hans has another dream of Klavdia as well, shortly after this. Mann describes it as a recurrent dream, and it is a wish fulfillment fantasy that Hans dreams twice in a single night. And this reveals still another darker reason, a third reason, why he desires her and why he wants to stay at the sanitarium. We're told there was one dream that Hans Castorp dreamed twice that night, and it was exactly the same both times. It came from the second time toward morning. He was sitting in the dining hall with its 7 tables, and the glass door banged shut louder than ever, and in came Madame Chauchat, wearing her white sweater, one hand in her pocket and the other at the back of her head. Instead of proceeding to the good Russian table, the ill-mannered woman walked soundlessly up to Hans Castorp and silently extended her hand to him to kiss, not the back, but the palm. Hans Castorp kissed her hand, her unrefined, slightly broad hand with its stubby fingers and jagged cuticles, and once again he felt sweeping through him from head to foot the sense of dissolute sweetness that had risen up inside him when he had tried out what it must be like to be free of the pleasures of honor and to enjoy the unbounded advantages of disgrace. And he experienced the sweetness again in his dream, except that it was overwhelmingly sweeter now. There's a Dionysian urge at work here, of course, for this pleasure of sweetness in the unclean kiss. In kissing the palm of her dirty hand, Hans feels the pleasure of casting off honor, the pleasure of embracing disgrace, the savor of the dissolute. All the things his bourgeois upbringing would have him abhor now in this kiss are released. And his surrender to the kiss, of course, is one that comes because Klavdia seems silently to demand it in this dream. And it suggests, since she holds out her hand to be kissed, the palm of her hand, it suggests Hans's longing unconsciously for a complete surrender to physical and moral corruption through Klavdia, everything conferred by that Dionysian kiss. It is a morbid temptation that Hans has tried to resist in his waking life, but which is so deeply rooted in his unconscious that it finds and seeks gratification in his dreams. Now, if Lawrence showed through Gerald and Gudrun that sexual desire is not, as Freud suggests, necessarily as a form of eros oppositional to the death wish, but rather that they can in fact be a longing for the death wish through sexual desire, if Lawrence suggests that, Mann reveals that at least some forms of sexual passion, like Hans's for Klavdia, certainly contain an attraction to death as one of their fundamental elements. Consider Hans's thoughts, for example, about death apart from the fascination with the diseased body of Klavdia. As, for example, when he overhears Herr Alban threatening suicide, he has this curious response to the idea of an individual ready to take his own life and enter the realm of death. Hans tried putting himself in Herr Alban's shoes and imagining how it must be when one is finally free of all the pressures honor brings and one can endlessly enjoy the unbounded advantages of disgrace. And the young man was terrified by a sense of dissolute sweetness that set in his heart pounding even faster for a while, the same dissolute sweetness he felt in his dream when he kissed the palm of Klavdia's death-ridden hand. Hans's attraction to bodily corruption and death in his desire for Klavdia is, however, only one side of Hans's twofold view of death. Remember that he formulated even when he was a boy, looking down at the coffin of his grandfather. Remember, there is also for Hans a spiritual side to death. And his interest, Hans's interest, in that spiritual side also comes back at the Berghof. As, for example, when he sees the fleeting glimpse of a dying young man and thinks as he gazes at that face, quote, what dignity the young man had when he laid his head against the pillows. Something about the iconic image of this individual and the last moments of his life makes Hans feel a sense of nobility. After seeing him, Hans even tries, we're told, to make the same large, meaningful eyes as those of the dying man, as if somehow he could understand the spiritual experience of death by mimicking the expression on the face of the man he sees. But just as he in the process of doing this, trying to in some way grasp the spiritual side of death through this mimicry, at that very moment, Klavdia comes out of another door, of another room, her own room, number 7, of course. And when she comes out, she takes and holds his gaze, suggesting a very different kind of physical attraction to corruption. There is nothing spiritual about Hans's morbid attraction to her, only the fascination with Eros as in the context of physical breakdown, with erotic beauty in a state of inner decay. Now, in drawing thus far on Hans's dreams to explain his desire to stay at the Berghof, I have stressed the wish fulfillment aspect, okay? He wants to stay to learn. He wants to stay because of Klavdia. He wants to stay because of his fascination with death. But I would point out that in his longest multipartite dream, of which I've talked about several sections, there are 2 portions of that dream that are not wish fulfillments, okay? They do not concern barons or Klavdia. Rather, they are nightmares. And one of them is driven by fear, one part of this nightmare, and the other is driven by frustration. The fear part of nightmare in the dream arises with the appearance of Krakowski. He suddenly shows up after Hans borrows the pencil from Klavdia, and Hans immediately regards Krakowski as a terrifying threat. Hans was trying to get away from Dr. Krakowski, who was lying in ambush for him in hope of subjecting his psyche to dissection, which aroused in Hans Castorp wild, truly mad terror. His foot was injured, and Hans limped as he fled from the doctor down among the balconies, squeezing past the glass partitions, and he took a possibly fatal leap down into the garden, and in his distress tried to climb up the reddish-brown flagpole, clearly a version of the pencil, and woke up in a sweat just as his pursuer grabbed him by the trouser leg. Well, Krakowski claims to be able to, quote, pierce the dark unconscious and thereby cure patients by bringing them to a conscious understanding of the desires that they have stifled. Hans fears this painful, quote, dissection, and he runs from it in terror. The flagpole that he tries and fails to climb is a version of the phallic red pencil, okay? Well, taken together then, these symbols suggest that Hans fears that Krakowski will reveal to him, through analysis, his sexual insufficiency, that Krakowski will make Hans aware of that insufficiency at a time when Hans is enthralled by the woman from whom he borrowed the pencil. Hans' doubts about his manhood are suggested in this part of the dream by his injured foot. But Hans also associates this condition of castration or sexual impairment with Krakowski. He sees Krakowski as a castrating figure, someone who can expose his insufficient manhood and in doing so make him even more insufficient. This is why in the dream Hans feels Krakowski clutching at his trouser leg as if in some way to dismember him. Well, Hans's sexual insecurity is understandable in a modest young man who has had little sexual experience, none with respectable women, and whose only previous romantic crush was on a male schoolboy. Now, the other unpleasant part of Hans's multipartite dream involves the appearance of Setembrini. And this is a nightmare, one say, not so much of fear, but one might say a nightmare of resistance, of inconvenience. A part of the dream that seems in some way to block his desire for Klavdia. Note here that Setembrini is a man who wants to help others, not like Krakowski, by dabbling into the dark, irrational, unconscious, but rather, in Settembrini's case, by trying to make his listeners see the light of reason so that they cast off their inhibiting instincts and superstitions completely. Mann's novel features several pairs of dialectically opposing characters, and as we'll see, Settembrini himself has three different antagonists, or opposites, if you will. Krakowski is one of them. Setembrini despises the psychiatrist as a witch doctor and as his moral antithesis. On the other hand, Settembrini's intellectual antithesis and antagonist is, as we're going to be seeing, a character named Leo Naphtha, whose medievalist authoritarianism is at odds with Settembrini's vision of humanistic democracy. The two will get in debates we'll start talking about in the next lecture. And Settembrini has a third dialectical antagonist, Claudia. As an artist, not as an intellectual or as a moral figure, but as an artist, Settembrini is emphatically an Apollonian figure, a writer and an artist who celebrates the formal beauty he sees in certain works of art as the expression of rationality, proportion, and idealism. Settembrini celebrates this Apollonianism this way. He said, according to the outline Setembrini presented, two principles were locked in combat, and one of them was the humanistic. Humanism, where he says, had been accused of exaggerating the importance of form, but humanism cultivated beautiful form purely for the sake of the dignity of man, was in brilliant antithesis to the Middle Ages, which had sunk not only into misanthropy and superstition, but also into ignominious formlessness. Okay, so the ideas then of proportion and idealism in art are central to Settembrini's rationalism and humanism. But I've noted that Claudia, with her slackness and disorder and Eastern sensuality, embodies a different aspect of the artist, the Dionysian antithesis to Settembrini's classical Apollonian idealism. Thus, if Krakowski is his moral opposite and Naphtha is his intellectual opposite, Claudia is, one might say, his aesthetic opposite. And Settembrini sees what she is. He warns Hans against his attraction to her in life, but before he warns him in life, he warns him in Hans's dream. Now, the Dionysian or Asiatic element in human nature, as Settembrini would have it, is what he wants to eradicate, or at very least suppress. And this is necessary for Settembrini in order to fulfill his vision of human progress under the banners of reason and independence and enlightened brotherhood, as opposed to sensualism and religion and superstition. Thus, he says that there is really two principles operating locked in combat in the world: might and right, tyranny and freedom, superstition and knowledge, obstinacy and ferment, change and progress. Well, everything he believes in, of course, in that pair of binaries is obvious: right, freedom, law, and progress, not superstition, not tyranny, and certainly not disordered change, all of which he associates with the Asiatic or Dionysian element in human nature that he wants to remove and that Claudia embodies. Now, when he talks about brotherhood, when he speaks, for example, there will come the dawn of a universal brotherhood under the emblem of reason, and it will lead to the republic of the world, but to achieve this goal, it is necessary above all to strike at the Asiatic principle of bondage and obstinacy at its vital center. When he speaks of this vision of a universal brotherhood toward which he is working under the banner of reason, we should note that by brotherhood, Settembrini does not mean the passionate bonds of Dionysian communal celebration, obviously. Rather, he means bonds of brotherhood forged by a shared understanding of what is best in man, that is, reason, an understanding that this pedagogue wants to foster in Hans. Now, why does Hans resist Settembrini in his dream, as he will later in part resist him in life? In the dream, you remember, when Settembrini approaches him with kind of an admonitory way, Hans tries to push Settembrini away, to push him off balance. And he says to Settembrini in the dream, "You bother me." Why? Well, Settembrini represents, in this particular psychodrama, what Freud would call Hans's superego. That is to say, the socially formed self, or part of the psyche, that holds itself to a behavioral standard shaped by the highest values of that society and seeks to rein in the urges of the id. In short, for Freud, the superego is the voice of conscience, internalized, if you will. Now, it's certainly easy to internalize for Hans when he has Setembrini preaching to him. Hans certainly feels this force of conflict when he meditates his attraction to Claudia, this inner voice, this conscience, this Setembrini, who, as in the dream, warns him against those dangers. We're told Frost-Shochat had looked up at him with those Kirzov eyes and made him feel as if he were locked up together with something inevitable and inescapable, an inescapability that both cheered and alarmed Hans. It filled him with hope and at the same time with an eerie, even threatening sense of helplessness that stole over the young Hans Castorp, setting in motion a vague instinctual groping, a search for help. One might say he was looking about deep inside himself for advice and support. In short, looking for himself in the face of his attraction for the conscience, the Setembrini figure, internalized. And indeed, he sometimes seeks Settembrini's counsel, even though he also resists it, as he does in the dream. Because in that dream, where in his unconscious life the superego is weakened more than it is in our waking days, and the instinctive urges are played out and stronger in the form of an attempted wish fulfillment, in that dream then, Hans, rather than listening to Setembrini or referring back to the Setembrini he's internalized in his superego, in the dream he wants to remove Setembrini and his conscience as impediments to the desire for Claudia, for this woman who he dreams he has kissed her unclean palm. Now, he doesn't want Setembrini then to awaken his conscience in the dream or his reason against Claudia. He desires her as the embodiment of eros and disease in ways that challenge everything Setembrini advances. Setembrini makes his opposition to those tendencies in Hans quite clear without mentioning Claudia's name throughout the course of the novel. And then, in fact, he does mention her name. But Claudia, like Krakowski, represents the dark, depraved forces in human nature for Setembrini that he is struggling to subdue. And he sees Hans in danger. He sees that Hans is, among other things, a little bit too interested in disease, and that his interest in disease seems linked to his interest in Claudia. Illness is definitely not elegant, young man, he tells Hans, and certainly not venerable. Such a view is itself a sickness, or leads to it. Reason and enlightenment, however, have banished those shadows which once lay encamped in the human soul. Not entirely, however, for even today the battle is still being waged. The battle, however, is called work, sir. Earthly labor, work for the earth, for the honor and the interests of humankind. And steeled by each new day in battle, the powers of reason and enlightenment will liberate the human race entirely and lead it forth on paths of progress and civilization toward an ever brighter, milder, purer light. Setembrini is so distrustful of instinct and passionate feeling that he tells Hans that he even objects to music on moral grounds as, quote, something unlike writing that is semi-articulate, dubious, ambiguous because, quote, it makes our emotions inflamed. The only thing that he tolerates about music is the way it divides time mathematically into measures. But he fears that the Dionysian element of music overrides this Apollonian orderliness, though it's clear that music partakes of both the Apollonian and the Dionysian. As Mann once memorably said, music is mathematics raised to mystery. Now, Hans feels a tug of war, clearly, within him, between his desire for Claudia and the voice of Setembrini. And he tells himself that he will sometimes listen to Setembrini, but he tells himself that he will do so in part as a compensation for continuing to maintain in an unchecked way his desire for Claudia. Mann puts it rather charmingly, for it cannot be denied that opposition was stirring in Hans's soul. both the sort that had always been there naturally from the start and the sort that arose specifically from his present situation. To put our suspicions and true understanding of the matter into words, Hans had probably listened to Herr Setembrini for one purpose only, to be given carte blanche by his conscience, a license it had been unwilling to grant him at first, to go on thinking about Klavdia Shoshat, who stood, listless, worm-eaten, Kiersegide, and whatever Hans thought of her, although thought is an all too inhibited word for describing how he turned inwardly toward her, it seemed to him that he was sitting again on that boat in the lake in Holstein and gazing with dazzled, bewildered eyes out into the glassy daylight across the eastern sky in the moonlit night, draped in the web of mist. In short, he indulges these fantasies and his desire for her by counterbalancing them by listening to Setembrini as a kind of compensatory moral fumigation. But I think that while there is truth to this assessment on the part of Mann's narrator, it would be wrong to assume that Hans listens to Setembrini's lectures only so that he can indulge his desire for Klavdia with less guilt. In truth, Hans is also drawn to Setembrini's ideas themselves, because as an Apollonian writer, the Italian appeals to that submerged Apollonian artist in Hans, just as Klavdia appeals to the submerged Dionysian side of Hans's submerged artistic nature. Hans finds Setembrini fascinating. He loves listening to his eloquence, and sometimes he even looks to Setembrini for intellectual, if not moral, direction, as in his early months at the Berghof. We're told that for inner support, Hans would do well to give Setembrini novel nature a try. Rebellious and critical, though sentimental and bombastic too, it was all true about Setembrini. He had called himself a pedagogue after all, and apparently Setembrini wanted to exercise some influence, to exert it, and young Hans Castorp craved to be influenced. Cautious, attentive, puzzled, but willing to let himself be influenced, Hans listened to the Italian's tales, which opened up a strange and very new world to him. Now, nonetheless, to Setembrini's dismay, Hans isn't a passively receptive student. Instead, he becomes increasingly aware of inconsistencies and paradoxes in Setembrini that puzzle him. For example, although Setembrini is an exponent of rationalism, he also personally seems rebellious, constantly refusing the doctor's orders, even at the risk of his own health, because he objects to Baron's authority as if it were a form of political tyranny of the kind his grandfather fought against. Rather irrational on his part. Also, when Hans suggests an intrinsic connection between illness and intellectual stimulation, which certainly Mann has demonstrated, Setembrini denounces that linkage. He insists that instead, illness doesn't stimulate the mind, it's an insult to the mind. Illness is incompatible with knowledge rather than a trigger for it. Yet the fact is that having said this, Setembrini is unable to explain how an intellectual, like himself, is also a very sick man. And then there's the paradox that the same Setembrini who warns Hans against the lure of Klavdia is so pruriently interested in the tawdry affairs of his fellow patients, gossiping about them and teasing the dreadful Froster about her illicit tryst in the pastry shop. Even though Setembrini prides himself on his clarity and consistency then, he, like everyone else in the novel, is a riddle of contradictions. Why? Because, like every other human being after Adam Qualman, he is inherently double-natured. And one of the things that makes Hans Castorp such an extraordinary student in Mann's Bildungsroman is that he can spot these paradoxes in others, these inconsistencies. But even more, the fact that he can find those inconsistencies and paradoxes fascinating, such as the paradoxes of time. Another gift Hans has as a student is his openness to multiple points of view, but an openness that is balanced by a critical ability to question any and all claims, beginning, of course, with Setembrini's. Thus, for example, we are told that it was out of a sense of duty to be fair and balanced that Hans Castorp listened to Herr Setembrini. With the best of intentions, however, he tested the man's views on reason, the world republic, and the beautiful style. Above all, then, this testing, even as he's open-minded, but above all, what distinguishes Hans as a learner is his habit of dialectical thinking. Hans sets views against one another, almost habitually, in contrast, in conversation, in debate, idea against idea. And this reflects, this tendency in Hans, the larger dialectical play of competing ideas and principles in Mann's novel itself. Now, when Setembrini tells Hans about his revolutionary grandfather, for example, Hans, in a dialectical way of thinking, is reminded of his own conservative grandsire at the opposite end of the political spectrum. And this leads Hans to consider the opposing political ideologies that these men, the revolutionary and the conservative, represent. Hans, in doing so, shows that he is the lord of counterpositions. He loves to set position against position as a way of thinking. For example, of these two old men, he thinks of them, they had both worn black, the grandfather in the north and Settembrini's in the south, and both for the purpose of drawing a strict line between themselves and the evil present. But the one had done it as a show of his reverence for the past and to honor death, to which his whole life already belonged, and the other, Settembrini's grandsire, had done so out of rebellion and in a belief of irreverent progress. Yet those were two worlds, two opposing points on the political compass. Hans Castorp thought, and as Sir Setembrini went on talking, he stood there halfway between them, so to speak, casting a critical eye on the first and then on the other. Now, note that in this meditation on opposing political perspectives, Hans sees not only the differences, but also the paradoxical similarities of these two. The awareness of this similarity, that they both dressed in black, that they both revered the past, suggests the similarity within difference. And it points to a crucial discovery that Hans is going to make in his education. It's this: the realization that when an ideology goes far enough to one particular extreme, it ironically comes around to resemble its opposite. It embraces, unknowingly sometimes, the very set of principles that it has been trying to oppose or to overturn. Before ending today, very soon, I want to say a few words about a theme that arises from the novel's pitched intellectual debates: the status of language. Setembrini is a polyglot. He's a man of letters. He's a writer and a polemicist who believes that words enlighten and transform the world. Now, these assumptions reflect his conviction that words, even after the division of language it babbles, can still do two things. First, he believes that words can bring minds together in shared understanding, that words, in short, can communicate. He is, after all, a teacher. And second, Setembrini believes that words can connect the signifier with the signified. That is, that language can represent objects and ideas with precision and with clarity, so that the word and the object become conjoined. Now, Hans marvels in this latter regard at how the Italian seems capable, even in acquired German, of somehow using words that seem to express the things he's describing so fully that they are almost versions of those things. They're almost like hard, brittle objects. Hans imagines the words themselves as embodied. Each word leapt from Settembrini's mouth so round and appetizing. Listening to him always reminded me, Hans says, of fresh, hot buns. He goes on to observe that what's really important to him is not the lecture itself. Perhaps that's only secondary, but more especially the speaking of it, the way he lets his words roll and bounce like little rubber balls, and that he isn't at all displeased, in fact, if you pay attention to that language itself. Now, Hans finds, however, that he is less satisfied when Setembrini begins tossing around conceptual language. Not words that refer to specific objects, for example, but abstractions like virtue and civilization. This presents a problem, and Hans becomes aware of it. Setembrini says in one of his lectures, "There you have it, gentlemen, there you have it." And he spoke now about the word, about the cult of the word, about eloquence, which he called the triumph of humanity, because the word was the glory of humankind. He believed in the word, and it alone gave dignity to life. Not just humanism, but humanity itself, man's dignity and self-respect. They were inseparable from the word, for the word gave birth to the beautiful deed. All moral conduct and all moral perfection emanated from the spirit of literature, from the spirit of human dignity, which simultaneously was also the spirit of humanity and of politics. Yes, they were all one and the same force, one and the same idea, and could be summarized in a single word. What was that word? That word was civilization, and Setembrini released that word from his mouth and thrust his small yellow right hand into the air as if proposing a toast. Okay. The problem here isn't just the abstractness of a word like civilization to which he built. The fact is that in using that word, Setembrini has had to define the word civilization in relation to other contested abstractions, the word's dignity, the word's humanity. In order to define a word, an abstraction, he needs other abstractions. Now, Naphtha, when we meet him, is going to define civilization and humanity and dignity and virtue very differently, revealing that apart from the fact that we speak different languages, even speakers of the same language use certain words, particularly abstract words, in ways that not only fail to establish a clear and definite one-to-one relationship between word and referent, but which also fail to communicate coherently with other people. Now, at times, the novel's linguistic confusions can be comic, as, for example, when Froster uses malaprisms like primroses for premises, or when she says Tantalus when she means Sisyphus. We'll see more of this. But some words, Hans finds, are too serious to joke about, too serious and important to use sloppily. And the one word that troubles Hans the most, in the way in which it is glibly tossed about, is the word love, especially when someone like Krakowski uses the word love so often. The orator constantly invoked the word love in a gently irresolute sense so that one was never quite sure whether he meant it sanctified or more passionate in fleshly forms, leaving one feeling slightly nauseated and seasick. Never in his life had Kostrop heard this word spoken so many times in a row as he did here and now. Indeed, when he thought about it, it seemed to him as if he had never spoken it himself before or heard it pass anyone else's lips. He might have been mistaken, but at least he did not think such frequent repetition did the word love any good either. Note that there are, as Hans soon realizes, many different kinds of love. How then can one word refer to all of them with any meaning or precision? But on the other hand, Hans finds that there are certain words, more concrete words, that have a kind of talismanic power to transmit feelings that abstractions like the words love and humanity and civilization cannot. One such word is Claudia's first name. When he learns it, he cherishes the sound of that name as Marcel had with Gilbert's name. He repeats it to himself, listens for it, as if the syllables convey something specific and undeniable and intrinsic about the beloved object itself. Claudia, he said, yes, that's very likely it. The name suits her very well. He made no secret of his delight at having acquired this intimate knowledge, and from now on he only spoke of her as Claudia when he meant Frau Chauchat. How oft it thrills me just to hear you say some simple word. Yes, Claudia. Now, ironically, the other part of her name, Chauchat, in French, it refers to the name of a powerful gun used in World War I. A name therefore associated with death, which is after all implicit in Hans's desire for Claudia, and death, which is after all implicit in the historical movement of this novel toward World War I. But setting aside that dark association, you might wonder how Hans, who speaks no Russian, and Claudia, who struggles with simple German, if indeed their love is ever to blossom, will ever communicate. Whether we call it love or something else, what will they call it if they speak different tongues? How will they ever get together? Wait and see. Send me emails, send me questions, send me comments. I hope you get this.